Hello, I'm Paul from Mode 7, and today I'm going to be talking about the elephant in the room. This isn't the elephant in the room, this is. So this graph shows the games released on Steam per year, and as you can see there is a massive, unbelievable spike in 2014. So we're at a point where things have genuinely changed now. This was the thing that a lot of indies were worried about happening. It's saturation, effectively. There are so many new games coming out all the time, the press can't cover them, YouTubers can't cover them, so if there's something that even slightly turns them off the game, they will just walk away and leave it. Now, the problem with this is that it can be very disheartening. You can look at this and say, well, what are we even doing this? There's no chance of making money, it's ridiculous. And I think that this has always been on the cards for a long time. And a lot of the things that people do, particularly if you're making games on Steam, I think they still apply. So, firstly, I think it's important to look at why this happens. So it's like all kind of economic shifts, it's a conjunction of things. It's a result of people seeing the success of other companies on Steam and following them. It's a result of Greenlight, obviously, probably the major factor opening all the floodgates. And it's also a result of games getting easier to make, really good tools being free, people understanding the methods of making games, people moving out of AAA development into indie. That's all come together to cause this kind of conflagration which has changed the face of indie games. So if you look at those things, then are there aspects of that that you can turn into an advantage for you when you're making indie games? I think, as I said before, the truisms about indie game development are still true. One of the most important things now is that if you have a good concept, then you'll draw people in. So concept has just been amplified much more than it was before. Maybe before there was a time, perhaps between sort of 2007 and 2013, where if you released a lot of very well done but mediocre games, so kind of competently produced but not particularly conceptually exciting games, you could have made a lot of money by doing that in that time because of the restricted number of games on Steam. Admittedly, there were a lot of kind of mediocre games that fell down the cracks and really didn't make any money during that time either. But equally, that might have been a window for you. I think that's now over. If you were trying to do that, now you really have to shoot for those bigger concepts, the ones that kind of sell themselves. And it doesn't necessarily have to be original. It can be very subtle variations on existing things. I mean, you've all seen the number of very similar survival games on Steam. So that was a very sort of rich area where people could look at a general concept or a general idea of gameplay that people wanted and iterate on it, either make it better or make it different somehow or present it in a different way. So that onus is still really, really there. But what you've got to do more than anything else now is set up your company so that you can do that. And that might mean that maybe you're a lone developer and you need a certain amount of money to support yourself. If you're able to create games that support yourself, you can keep trying new things. If you're aiming for that big thing, you can keep trying new concepts and throwing them out. If you're a larger company, like we are at Mode 7, I mean larger than that, I don't mean large in the grand scheme of things, then what you have to do is look structurally at how you can keep going and keep trying new things with a bigger team. The risk is always going to be higher in that because you're paying people salaries and maybe you're paying for a certain level of art or a certain look, which can be expensive. But equally, you can look at some of the ways to compete. So one of the things we're looking at now is reducing development time. In Frozen Cortex, we spent a lot of time on some systems which ended up not being particularly important to the way the game was perceived. So what we've tried to do is identify those, identify why they took such a long time, and either cut them or change the way we're going to do them for the next game that we're going to make. Trying to get the idea out faster so you can see what the pros and cons of the idea are and how to work with it in basically a profitable way. I don't think that this level of saturation is going to cause an enormous destruction of indie as a market and sort of as an idea. But I do think it's going to be very difficult for people who are investing a lot of money into single projects that fail. If you're staking everything on one game, I think that can be a very dangerous situation if you don't have any residual revenue to back that up. But I do think it really emphasises the fact that you need to put yourself in a creatively fertile environment, and that might mean not spending too much early on a project, or it might mean allowing yourself some freeform time where you kind of scale right down and you just work on developing, whatever concept you want to come next. I think looking at other creative industries is really interesting in this context. So music, for example, is probably the most saturated, maybe writing, but music could be the most saturated creative industry. There are thousands and thousands of musicians. And the way to do well as a musician is to develop yourself so that you're doing something that's technically interesting, that's creatively coherent, and also to really, really concentrate on building that audience, reaching the audience of people who are interested in what you're doing, and doing it with integrity. So for me, musically, I've been able to get an audience through the Frozen Synapse soundtrack, and I now know that audience and I talk to them and I have a good understanding when I'm making something of, although I'm still working on things, for myself creatively, I have a good understanding of how that audience is going to feel and react to things that I'm doing. So I know what's a risk and what isn't a risk. If I release a folk album now, I know that's going to be a risk and it's going to take me away from my original audience. If I make dance music now, I know that I can bring some of that audience over to the dance music, who like the kind of more soundtracky electronica stuff. So there's some basis for that there. And I think you can really apply that to the idea of creativity in games. If you have a good understanding of what things your audience do and don't like about your work already, then you know when you're being risky. I don't think we necessarily knew that with Frozen Cortex. We didn't know sort of what the overlap was, and there was some overlap, but I think it wasn't as great as we anticipated. But a lot of this really is about trying to know really what your audience want and are expecting. What we've tried to do is kind of increase communication with our community a bit. It's always been something that's kind of quite difficult for us because we tend to develop along specific lines and we don't have time or resources to kind of move off the track to get games done. Otherwise our games would balloon out into like 8 or 9 year projects because they're more elaborate than other indie games. But actually listening to what people are saying about the features that they need and want in a game and the way they experience it is really important. And experience is the absolute key when it comes to games. If you look at the way players talk about games, the way journalists talk about games, and the way YouTubers film games, it's about player experiences. So when I'm playing XCOM, for example, and I'm between missions, I can see all of my units and their names, I can see what they've done in the past. As I'm upgrading them, I've kind of got these personalities almost that I'm developing, and my emotional connection to those units is really strong. When I take them on a mission, one of them dies, it's significant to me because they represent both my investment as a player and also narratively I've been able to kind of, come up with things in my head, or I'm sort of I've named them after someone I know. So there's a really strong connection that is a thread that runs right through the different gameplay types. Similarly, something like Crusader Kings 2, which I've also been playing recently, the depth and elaborate nature of the simulation means that every single one of your actions is connected to this entire universe of other actions. So you feel very powerful as the player when you're deciding to do something, and all of these little random interconnected things kind of feed off you as the prime motivator. Tom Francis had a really good talk recently that he gave at GDC, which I really recommend. It's in the GDC Vault. And he talked about a lot in interconnectedness in design. A lot of his design is basically predicated on that idea. Gunpoint and his new game, Heat Signature, are very much about kind of the chaos that ensues when the player has an idea. So if you're into that kind of design, it's not the only kind of game design. More linear, more structured game design can be really awesome as well. But if you like that kind of thing, then I definitely recommend checking that out. And it relates so much to this saturation issue, because as long as you're giving people an experience which is either unique or very interesting and makes them feel like they're doing something they want to do, it makes them play on their own strengths and weaknesses as a person and evaluate themselves and their own decisions. That's what PC gamers really want. PC gaming is a very total experience where you sit down at a dedicated machine and you're not being distracted necessarily by other things. You're really focused on kind of putting yourself into a world, putting yourself into a state. If you can create something that relates really strongly to that state and really affects people in terms of what they're able to do and the kinds of decisions they're making, then that's always going to be popular and it's always going to make money if you do it in a structured way. One of the things that's really, really difficult still is getting attention for your game sort of around the time of launching a beta or around the time of even launching the full version. And that's something that developers continually need to work on. I think for those of us who have some, there's some awareness of us already, it's about maintaining relationship with the public and with the press. So continuing to talk more, that's something I'm trying to do, even though I'm clearly incompetent at it. Making videos like this is just a way of saying, there is something that I can contribute to the conversation at the moment. There's a lot of people talking about the games industry and saturation and so on Twitter, and so I thought I would do a longer form thing and just share some thoughts. And if you are a developer who's been interviewed or you haven't been interviewed before and you want to start saying things, I think contributing to that conversation in a considered way is something that you can do that might get your name out there a bit more and might get a bit more attention to your games. So there's all these different ways that we need to think about how we're going to bring these interesting ideas to people's attention and capture them in this environment where there's a lot of things happening. I have a lot more thoughts on this, and if you like this kind of video, I will do more of them, so thank you.